All right, folks. My presentation this evening involves two different trips that I made recently to Europe. The first was in August of this past year, August 1st to 10th, which took me to Krakow, Poland, and also the Auschwitz camp. And then in November this past year, I went to a small town in the Bavarian Alps called Unterwassen. And from there, I went to Munich and a side trip off to the Dachau camp. So my presentation is going to encompass those two camps plus some others as well that we also visited. So we can go to the first slide there. Yes. Okay. This is the first picture in our group, and this is a photo of a house in the village of Unterwassen, Germany. Now, you may think, why do I have that there? Well, Linda, who's also in our group this evening, and I participated in an organization in June of 1974 called the Pennsylvania Ambassadors of Music. And it was made up of students from various high schools in the York County, Pennsylvania. It consisted of a choir and also musical, a band. And I know I was in choir, I think Linda was as well. And we made stops in various places in Europe, starting in London, Paris, Strasbourg, France. We also went to Munich and then ended up in Geneva, Switzerland. So it was about a 3-week period. But while we were in the Munich area, we stayed with German families in this little town of Unterwassen. And while we were there, we took a day trip to the Dachau camp. Now, that was my first exposure to anything of that nature. And let me tell you, it was absolutely mind-blowing to think of what went on there, within that camp. So over the course of time, I made 4 visits to there, the most recent being this past November. So from there, we can go to the next slide. All right. This past August, as I said, I participated in an organization sponsored by the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. Earlier last year, Mark saw on Facebook that they were having a seminar, summer academy, they called it, for foreign students in English. And it would consist of a 10-day period where you started first in Krakow, and then you went on to the Auschwitz and Birkenau camps. Now, I have a slide coming up that will show the participants in there that were in our group. But one of the first places we went to was the Old Town section of Krakow. And we visited the Jewish Museum there. We went to the Jewish cemetery. And we then went to this picture, which is called the Ghetto Heroes Square in Krakow. In the year 1939, Poland fell to the Nazis. And in 1941, all Jews in Krakow and surrounding areas were rounded up and put behind these huge concrete walls into a 16-block square area, and that's where they lived. They were forced to leave their homes, their businesses, and they were forced to live here. And at one point before the war, there was roughly 65 to 70,000 Jews living in Krakow. Today, there might be between 1,000 to 2,000. And in all of Poland, there was 5 3.5 million Jews before the war. Today, there may be between 10 to 20,000 Jews in all of Poland. What do the chairs symbolize? Well, there is actually 33 large chairs, and there's 37 smaller chairs. What they represent is the fact that people were forced to move into buildings such as you see there behind you, behind the chairs. And once the Nazis cleared out these thousands and thousands of Jews that were there, they went in and threw all their furniture, all their belongings into this square area. So as after the war ended, a memorial was set up to represent those people that were affected by this. And roughly 70 chairs equal the 70,000 Jews that were living there in at that time period. So where did these people go? Well, they took them away. They took them to camps, labor camps, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay. By the way, my hotel where I was staying in was at the end of this photo on the right-hand side. So it was part of the ghetto area, which has now been all developed. Next. This is the Schindler factory. You may know of Oscar Schindler, Schindler's List, which was a movie that Steven Spielberg did, I believe, in 1993. And I just watched that movie again last week because I wanted to refresh myself on what he did as far as the war effort. This is the factory. I did not go inside it. When I was there as part of the tour, you can see a lineup of people to get in. So, I mean, you had to have tickets, you had to have assigned times to get in. So I did not go in. But this is a huge building that takes up roughly 1 block of space there in Krakow. It was an enamel manufacturing business. It was established in 1937. And Oscar Schindler was actually a member of the Nazi Party. He owned the business, but he actually shielded and employed roughly 1,100 Jews as workers. Now, the Jews were not paid. And the SS, the secret guard, the Nazi guard, police, whatever you want to call them, they knew that he was doing this, and they allowed it to occur because they were the ones, the Nazis were receiving the hourly wages that he would have been paying the Jews. So in order to keep this shielded, he had to pay the Nazis to protect his workers. He evacuated the factory with his employees and went to live in the Czech Republic. Once he knew that the war was about at an end in 1944 into 1945, he evacuated the factory and left. And most of those people did survive. This plant now is no longer used as a factory. It is actually a museum. And I believe part of the offices are used by the city of Krakow. Now, where did his people live that worked there? Well, that's interesting. They took us to a labor camp called Plazzow, Plazzow, Plazzow labor camp. This is where his Jewish workers lived when they worked at his factory. And not only them, but others that worked at other places in the area. This place, the labor camp, is not close to here. It's roughly 35-minute walk, about a 1.5 mile walk. And they walked. I mean, there was no transportation to get them back and forth. So they walked there, they walked back home in all kinds of conditions, weather conditions. Okay. Next slide. Okay, this is a photo showing the concrete wall that surrounded the actual ghetto. It was over 10 feet high, and there's a memorial plaque on there. That's about the only section of the wall that's still standing. You may think, well, why didn't people try and escape? Well, they couldn't. The interior, there was barbed wire. It was patrolled so that the police, the guards, would not allow people to get out. So they couldn't really escape. There was one other thing I failed to mention. The square photo that I showed, of that 16-mile radius or 16 square block area, there was only one business that was allowed to operate. And that business was a pharmacy. And the pharmacy was right there at the square area. I was able to go inside. It's a replica of how it looked back in the 1940s. And the individual who worked there was not a Nazi, I don't believe anyway, and he assisted the Jews who were entrapped there. He and his workers would pass letters back and forth to family members. They also assisted with food, because food was a scarcity for those people living in that enclosed area. The conditions were deplorable, as we're going to see as we go forward here in some of these photos. And I should mention, I'm going to be very upfront with what we saw and what conditions were like in some of these camps as we go through here. So just be aware, this is reality.
Number one spot. Is he right? Is it Hamlet?
The next one, please.
Well done.
Okay, as we went through our walk through the Jewish area of Krakow, we came across this. This is the building there is home to the Jewish Community Center. And the banner that says "Bring them home now," again, this was back in the beginning of August when I was there, that references the Jewish plea to bring home the hostages that were in Gaza. That's what that's about. And of course, I guess I revealed myself when I was there, because I said to the guide, our tour guide, I said, look what's up there at that window on the 3rd floor. And sure enough, it's a gay flag. So I was pleased to see that. The host says you to start your video. Okay. So, yeah. So I guess my secret was revealed while I was there, which they all knew anyways. But anyhow, next one. Okay. This is a photo of our group. Now that we left Krakow, now we're in Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is actually in a town called Oswiecim. The Germans named it Auschwitz, but it's really the town of Oswiecim. And this is our group of 25 persons. Len was so kind there to signal me out there on the top row on the right. So that is proof that I actually was in this group. Again, they selected 25 of us. It was made up of 7 different countries. We came from the United States, the UK, Canada, Sweden, Germany, the Czech Republic, and Taiwan. And it was a good group. I didn't know what to expect. Traveling solo, I thought, I'm going to be the only solo person. Everybody else is going to have somebody with them. But that was not the case at all. Everybody there was solo. They all traveled by themselves. Some of them were Jewish, some were not. Yeah, I mean, it was a good group. We got along fine. So it was a good group. And our instructor was in the front there. Her name is Anna. She works for the museum in the educational department, and she was with us throughout this trip. And yes, you may go to the next one. Okay. I don't know how many of you have been to this camp in the past, but as you enter the camp, this is the sign you see. Now, it's not too clear because it's sort of hidden there by the trees. but it says Arbeit macht frei. And what that means in German is work will set you free, or work will make you free. Well, is that ever a falsehood? The work that these people went through can't even be described. So they were given false hope as soon as they entered this complex. You're going to see there, as you look down the row, there's brick buildings. Most of this camp is intact, as what it was back in the 1940s. Because most of the buildings are brick. The one on the left there is wood, but most of them are brick. So a lot of them are still standing. We can go to the next one. All right. This photo was taken as we entered through that gate, and I looked to the right side. Now, on the far right is the concrete wall. That separated the camp from the outside world. Our education center was right outside that wall. So all we had to do was walk out the back of that building, go in a short path through security. Everything was through security. There was security guards everywhere. You had to go through security to enter into the camp. What do you see here? You see a huge wall. You see a watchtower where the guards were. Many watchtowers were throughout this whole complex. You see a gravel path. Then you see a wall that's barbed wire fence with electricity. So it was electric. You saw lights. Then you saw another path, and then another row of barbed wire fences. This was designed to keep the people inside. They did not want anyone to escape. Some sections of the camp, the one path here, which is now gravel, was water. So if you wanted to escape, you'd have to go through water to get to the next fence area. Sometimes the guards would walk through there patrolling German Shepherd dogs to keep people out. Of course, the watchtowers all had guards with guns. So trying to escape out of this camp was nearly impossible. Some people did. Some people tried it. Some people threw themselves against the gates, the fences, because they felt that it was better to commit suicide than endure what they had to in the camp. Okay, we can go to the next one, Lynn. This one, okay, this one is a photo that is of an orchestra. Now, you may think an orchestra in a concentration camp. Why would that be? Well, let me read what the sign says. It says the camp orchestra had to assemble here to play marches while the prisoners filed past. This was to help prisoners keep in step and make it easier to count them as they went in and out from work. So they were there in all kinds of weather playing marches. Their belief was that it would help soothe the people and they would work better. And that was taken by way in 1941. And that building is still there. You can go to the next one, please. All right, this is a slide. Many of the buildings that are there now that remain back in the wartime were housing prisoners, and they call everybody prisoners, regardless if it was because they committed a crime or they were brought there because of what religion they practiced. They call everybody prisoners. So some of those bunkers where these people slept are now museum spaces, and many of them are taken over with exhibits by the country from where some of these prisoners came from. So they have displays in there and photographs and so forth of people. But what this slide says is Auschwitz was the largest Nazi German concentration camp, and since 1942 was the mass extermination center for Jews. In the years 1940 to 45, the Nazis deported at least 1.3 million people to Auschwitz. 1.1 million were Jews, between 140 to 150,000 Poles, 23,000 Romanians, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and 25,000 others from other ethnic groups. 1.1 million of these people died in Auschwitz, and approximately 90% of the victims were Jews. The SS murdered the majority of them in the gas chamber. In Auschwitz itself, and I'm going to mention here that the Auschwitz complex consists of 3 different locations, main locations. There was Auschwitz, there was Auschwitz-Birkenau, and then there was also Monowitz. So there was 3 large camps. Initially, Auschwitz was a Polish military camp, and it was really selected by the Nazis to be used as a extermination camp, call it what you want, or labor camp, because it had ample transportation lines. It had 4 direct train lines coming into this facility. So they thought it would be good for that purpose. Believe it or not, and I'm just going to read off some random notes that I took while I was there. Auschwitz was also a center for agricultural studies. They had a building devoted to growing crops and doing things, use of the land. And this I find odd, but it was also used as a center for breeding Angora rabbits. So imagine that. Angora rabbits were raised and breeded in the same facility where people were slaughtered. In the very beginning, this facility was used to house Soviet prisoners of war. And starting in June of 1940, they started transporting Soviets there, and they brought in around 10,000 prisoners. Then, if you want to call stage 2, in 1942, this camp was converted to a camp for Jews. Their belief was that Jews who are unable to work should be killed. And during that time, around 1,440 dead bodies a day were placed in the crematorium. They were burned. And the first train of Jews came from the country of Slovakia. Then they go into stage 3 of the history of the camp, where they considered it a camp for the execution of all European Jews. They were placing roughly 4,756 persons per day into the gas chamber. And that also then, they added the Birkenau camp. They didn't have enough space for all these people, so they then constructed the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. Now, that was roughly 3 miles away from this camp. It was much larger, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And Birkenau could accommodate up to roughly 200,000 prisoners. Auschwitz about 100,000. So combined, they had at any given time maybe 300,000 people there. I posed the question to our tour guide. I said, well, I recently had a 23andMe ancestry test done. And to my surprise, I came back 3% Jewish. So I said, if that test were administered to all those people who went in there, how many of those people were killed unknowingly because they really weren't Jewish? And that's the thing, you don't know. He said that in the census report that had to be done, they were asked what their religion was. And if they said they were Jewish, or I guess if they even looked maybe as if they were Jewish, that was cause for arresting. The other thing I asked about was gay people. You know, what about the gays? They rounded up gays. They certainly were. I found it hard to believe that they said that there was maybe only 200 documented gays that were murdered. Again, how did they know if they were gay? Well, in Germany, you could be arrested under suspicion of being gay. And if you had a police record because your morals weren't correct according to them, that would be reason for you to be arrested. We can go on to the next one, yes. Okay. This is a photo that I snapped in one of the museums, and this is called the selection process. Now, what I want you to understand on this is, this was actually taken, this photo is not in Auschwitz, it was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, the sister camp, which I'll show you some photos from that in a minute. But this is what they called the selection process. Okay, people got off the train. They were shipped here from wherever. The last group that were sent there in mass was the Jews from Hungary in 1944. And I believe this is what this photo was from. It was snapped up in the air. You can see it looks to be as if there's women on the left side of the photo and men on the right-hand side of the photo. People in front of them are SS guards or Nazis. They were told to separate by sex, and the small children also went with the women. There may be somebody there. Many times it was a man by the name of Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was renowned for his medical experiments that he would do on prisoners. And many times he was the person there selecting who was going to live and who was going to die based on their ability to work. So most of the women did not survive, or the children. The men may have. If you were smart enough, many of these people didn't know what they were doing. They thought they were going to a labor camp. They didn't know that this was possibly the end of their life. You don't see it in this photo, but they don't carry suitcases. They were told when they left their houses of where they lived originally, they could only take one suitcase with them. And they were told to put their name on their suitcase. So when they arrived here to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the trains brought them in, they unloaded. And by the way, I should tell you, the trains, many of the people on those trains came from 4 days away, especially if they were coming from Hungary. They may have been 4 days away from reaching here. They were on a train in a boxcar used for cattle. It was filthy. It was a very small window up near the top of the box. And from there, they were on that train for 4 days, standing. It was so crowded, 60, 70 people in a boxcar. They had a bucket in the corner where they could urinate, but they had no food, other than maybe any food they brought with them. But they were not given food. So, and they had no idea where they were going. So they reach this destination. They get off the train. They're told to separate. The man is standing there. He tells you to go either left or right. If you went, say, to the right side, you immediately went to the gas chambers. If you went to the left side, more than likely, you were spared. Immediate death, anyway. Because they wanted people to work. That was their main thing. Could they work? And 25% of the people in this photo probably survived. The rest did not. After they were selected, well, those who went to the gas chambers, they were never, most of these people were never registered. They were never put on the records as to who they were. So we don't know who they were. Many of them we don't. We're all these numbers we give out are estimates because we're only estimating the number of people that's involved. But those that stayed in the camp were registered and they were tattooed, and they had a tattoo placed on their forearm, a tattoo that anybody gave. I mean, they went somewhere and had it done, but certainly wasn't as professional as we think of today. So they had a tattoo inscripted on their arm. Okay, next one. Now, if you were fortunate enough, you were employed to work in what they call Canada. And Canada was large warehouses where the workers sorted through the luggage. They looked for valuables. They wanted things that they could send back to the Reich, back to the Nazis. That was their goal, to see what people brought with them, separate it, and then dispose of it or get rid of it. And that's what this is. They named the prisoners named it Canada because Canada actually means the land of plenty. This was a cherished job by the prisoners. If they were able to work there, their working conditions and living conditions were maybe a little bit better than if you did not work here. Okay, next one. What is this? This was in a big display in one of the buildings. This is a gathering of items from the prisoners. Their crutches, their prosthesis, maybe their wheelchairs if they were fortunate enough to bring it. But these are items from the prisoners. Next. What's this? These are shoes. These are shoes of the individuals who were brought into the camp. Now, going back, if you were able to work, you were stripped of your clothing, you had to be disinfected, you were told to select shoes, whether it was your size or not, who knows. You got shoes, and most people wore those striped uniforms. Some people didn't. They could pick a dress or something. It depended. It depended. But these are shoes of the prisoners. And I want to share some facts with you about that. The museum has collected roughly 40,000 pairs of shoes, 3,800 suitcases, 12,000 dishes. Again, people didn't know where they were going. So they would bring maybe dishes with them, only to find out they were useless because they couldn't use them once they got there. 470 artificial limbs. We were given a tour of the area where they collect and preserve the artifacts from the prisoners. And they, to this day, I would like to work in that area. They took us in there and they showed us suitcases that they still get from people that were at the camp. Maybe their relatives find them in an attic stuck somewhere, or documents or something indicating that they were at some point or another in a camp. and they turn them over to the museum. They call them, they say they found things, they'll donate things, they'll restore things in these at this museum. And I asked whether or not they will pay people for these items, and they said yes, they will, if they can authenticate it, if they can verify the fact that these actually were legitimate objects from a prisoner at some point or another. And I also want to mention, let me see here. Yes, the other thing, and I think that's on the next slide. No, I'm sorry, I did. There was a slide I did not put in. Well, we couldn't take a picture of it, and I'll tell you why. We went through a display window, and it was nothing but hair. It was hair from the prisoners. So in other words, when they went through the registration process, they showered, they were then shaved. So all their body hair was shaved. And when they died, before they went through the cremation process, they were shaved. They kept the hair, they kept any gold fillings that they found in the deceased. They estimate that roughly 2 tons of hair was sent to Berlin. You never guess what they used it for. They used the hair for mattresses, to put in mattresses. So, when the Soviets came in and liberated this camp, they found roughly 7 tons of hair. So, one of the buildings, this is prisoner photos. One of the buildings that we went into has all these photos displayed of prisoners that were in the camp. I want to make you aware of the fact that if you go on the Auschwitz Memorial Site or Auschwitz Museum, they have a Facebook page. You can sign up, and on a daily basis, they will send you a photo of one of the prisoners with the day they were born. Typically, they'll send it to you the day of their birth, and then they'll just put on there the name of the individual, their the day that they came to the camp, and the day they died. It's a mind-boggling thing, and some people, may not like that, but I get it. And I want you to also know that the people that were registered did get, when they died, if they had record, they were there. They did issue them a death certificate, believe it or not. They did issue a death certificate. What did they normally put on there for reason of death? They normally put on there that this person was not able to live in society, which is horrible. Absolutely horrible. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is a slide showing the number of Jews and where the country they came from. I'm just going to mention on this one that the most Jews of the 6 million plus that were murdered came from Poland, roughly 2.9 million. Looks like the next largest was Hungary, and then Romania was up there. Yeah, and Lithuania over 100,000. So, yeah, that gives you a breakdown of where they originated from. The next slide, we are now at the medical block, and this is where the German doctors did experiments on people. They were fascinated by short people. They were, if you were a twin, they would keep you because they wanted to do experiments on why you were twins. They wanted to to do experiments on women. There would be thousands of women that would go there, that they'd make them infertile. They would remove organs. They would do all kinds of tests on people. And they were also fascinated with pregnant women. Women were brought there that were pregnant or got pregnant while they were in camp, believe it or not. And most of the times, though, they took the baby and killed it. But Mengele and his group of doctors worked in this. There was a hospital on site, so they supposedly would treat you. Disease was rampant in the camp. Typhus fever. People would die from typhus. The main reasons that, other than being killed because you were Jewish or what have you, was the fact that it was a disease going through the camp. Lice was horrible in the bunkers, and of course, people committing suicide, or disease, as I mentioned. Okay, next one is the gas chamber. The Auschwitz camp had one gas chamber, and this is the interior of that. It was a concrete building in a basement. You went from the outside down a ramp into this section. Now, I think there might have been a room outside here where the prisoners were told to undress. They all came in here nude. They were told that they were getting a bath, that they had to be disinfected before they could go to their living area. Well, needless to say, that was not the case. The shower heads are not showing on here, but there were shower heads in here. The death occurred by 2 cylinders containing Zyklon B gases. They were put down from the roof, dropped down in, and within 20 minutes, everybody inside would die. They could do this in about 1,000 or so per group. From here, they went to the next place, and the next slide will show that. Those that died then went upstairs, and the workers took them by cart and put them into those ovens. That's where they went. Now, the book that I read you from, that book that I shared from, this girl came to the camp with her family members. She had a mother and a father, and she had 5 younger brothers. At the selection process, she was spared because they thought she could work. Her father was spared. All the other family members went to their deaths in the chambers. Her father worked in this section of the camp. He was Jew. He was called a Sonderkommando. And his job was to take the dead bodies from the gas chamber, put them into the crematory. That was his punishment for being a Jew. He knew he would not live long at that job because the Nazis, every so many months, would switch out the workers there, and they would kill them because they didn't want this to get out to the public, what was going on. Okay, the next slide shows us in the camp of Birkenau. Now, this is the large camp. This is the second one that was added. There was approximately 370 buildings on this camp. And this photo I took is from the inside looking towards the entrance. So there's the watchtower, one of them up there. And this is the train track that brought the people in. Okay. To the left is a white area that's surrounded. And I'll tell you what that is on the next photo. This is an aerial view that I took from the top of the watchtower. And this one is shows the train tracks leading to the back. There's about 170 some acres to this complex. The little white thing there is the only train car that remains, the cattle car that was brought in with the prisoners, and that's the only one that remains, and it is being renovated. So that's why it has that white thing around it. You can see on this photo there on the left side, that building is the kitchen, the only kitchen in the camp. And then there's, if you would go to the right side, there's some buildings that remain of some barracks and so forth that are still there. This particular facility had over, as I said, 370 buildings on it. And let me just get some statistics quickly here of what was there. It was built from scratch in 1941. It was originally farmland. It's about 3 miles from Auschwitz. And some of these prisoners worked in this camp from Auschwitz. So they went there daily. They walked back and forth 3 miles every day to get to their work detail. It was built from scratch. Hitler only came to one camp in his lifetime, and it was not any of these. He was some camp, other camp in Poland. There was roughly, I think they said there's roughly 100 some satellite camps. These aren't the only camps in Poland. It was originally used for Soviet prisoners of war. Then it became the women's camp. A section of it housed all the women. So the women in the other camp came over here. Believe it or not, they also had families that lived there. They had German or Polish Jewish families that lived there, and they could live there with their families. Isn't that odd? Well, at one point, the Red Cross came and inspected this camp. The Germans only allowed them to see the family camp area, that section of the camp. Why? Because it looked normal. It looked like a camp. People lived together. They were happy. They were fed. That's what they saw. What do you think happened to them after they left? They were all murdered. All of them. Okay. Let's move on to the next photo. Okay. As we were walking through this camp, one of our persons in our group, this is Chloe. Chloe was a student in the university. She's from the UK. And we were walking, in the background is a destroyed gas chamber. This particular camp, because of its size, they had 5 different gas chambers and crematoriums. This is the only one, there's only one standing. This one was destroyed. To the left, where that person is walking, was an ash field. So the ashes of the deceased were buried. Some were thrown in the river, but at this particular place, there was an ash field there. So as we were walking around the perimeter, Chloe looked down and she found something. And it was an artifact. I believe it was an angel, some kind of an angel ornament or something or other. So we immediately gave it to our guide, and they passed it on to the authorities there. And they told us that it is not uncommon to this day to find items that were believed to be part of the prisoners that were there. And as the weather elements can affect the soil, and things can come to the surface. So it's our belief that maybe it did in fact belong to somebody that was there. Next one, yes. Okay. This was a slide that they showed us in one of our classes that we attended. We had classes, not only did we that, but we did touring as well. And one of the classes had to do with religious denominations of the SS personnel, the Nazi personnel. And this was a snapshot in time, and it shows that of 556 prisoners, or 56 personnel, 42% of them identified as being Catholic that worked in the camp. 36% identified as Lutheran, and 20% stating that they were non-believers or atheists. Now, that's only a small representation of the number of guards in the camps. There was thousands of guards in these camps. But at the time they did us, it just tells us that these people who put people to death had religious backgrounds too. How could they do that? Okay, in fact, most of the prisoners were Jews. The second largest denomination of prisoners were Catholic. The SS members required their members to identify in some manner of their religion. The SS persecuted Jehovah's Witnesses. They were a group that they killed. They did not like Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Zone of Interest. It was a recent theatrical release, and it depicted the gentleman by the name of Rudolf Hess, H-O-S-S or H-O-E-S-S, depending on your spelling. He was the commandant of the Auschwitz camp. He was a devout Catholic. He was a practicing Catholic. And he and his family lived in a house right on the other side of the wall at the Auschwitz camp. And if you watch that movie, it's very moving to think they lived a very normal life right outside the camp. He was convicted. When the war ended, he was convicted and he was hung. He was hung in the gallows in the Auschwitz camp. Okay, I'm going to share with you now on the next slide. We're almost at the end here. This slide, I think, was one of the most memorable for me. That's something I'm always going to remember. This was a photo that I took in the Hungarian Museum at the Auschwitz site. This is a woman. Her name is Margit Schwarz. Margit Schwarz. She's pictured there with her husband and child. This was taken sometime maybe in 1944, before she was transported to the Auschwitz camp. She went there. Her husband and child were killed. The photo on the right is what she looked at like on the day of liberation. She is nothing but a skeleton. That's the difference of how these people looked who spent their time in a camp. I don't know what became of her, but obviously she was starved. And this photo was taken by the British Army, by the way. But I just, as you walk through these museums and you see these people, how they look before and after, it was just amazing. And, you know, and I think, how can we as people do these injustices to somebody just because of what their religion is, just because of where they live, or, you know, who they love? It's just, I just find it unbelievable that that occurs. But anyway, that's a representation of that. Okay, this is the Dachau camp, which I'll talk very briefly on. This is in Germany. This is a photo inside the camp. This is the museum. And this was also at the time that it was operating. And by the way, this was the camp that operated the longest, from 1933 to 1945. It was the longest operating German camp. It was the first that the Nazis set up outside Munich, maybe 10 miles from Munich. And it closed in 1945. But this building now houses a museum, It at one time had the torture area where the prisoners were tortured. Yeah. Next photo will show you the bunkers. This, I believe, had 34 barracks like this on site. This is a replica. It was only 2 of them still standing. When the Germans realized that the war was ending and that they might get captured, they burned the buildings. These buildings were all wood, and they burned them. They burned the documents. Only 5% of the documents have been recovered by the museum. The Germans burned them. They got rid of them. They didn't want to be implicated for doing these mass murders. So they got rid of them. And, they got rid of a lot of things. And the Soviets took over the Auschwitz camp in Poland. The Americans came to this camp. So the Americans came here and liberated the prisoners. There was maybe 200 bunks in this building, but it could contain up to 2,000 prisoners per bunk. So it was overrun. Auschwitz camp was not, Dachau camp was not necessarily a death camp. It was a concentration camp. They just kept people there, and people died because of disease or starvation or suicide by the most part. And the next slide will show you the gas chambers and crematory. They only had one on site, and that was a brick building. But we were told the gas chamber was never used here. Even though it apparently was functional, they never used it. But they did use the crematory because they burned the dead bodies. So that was used. Okay, and the next slide shows 3 memorials that are on site here in Dachau. This is actually the Protestant Church Memorial. I did not go in it, but it is on site. And one thing they told us about this building is that you may not see it here, but when they build it without any corners. All the buildings it's angled such that it's rounded. And they did that in defiance of the Germans, because the Germans had all their buildings with corners, which is interesting. There is also a Catholic memorial on site, and there is also a Jewish one. Okay, and the next one shows a statue that's right outside the crematory, and it was done by a gentleman by the name of Fritz Kohli. He's a German sculptor. He did it in 1949. The inscription reads, "To honor the dead, to remind the living." To honor the dead, to remind the living. And the statue represents a prisoner. And the next one. Okay. This was our guide for this particular tour, and he was excellent. And he's holding up a photo showing the prisoners on the day of liberation. The camp in Dachau was liberated on April 29th of 1945. The Auschwitz camp was liberated by the Soviets on January 27 of 1945. So their memorial anniversary is coming up the end of this month, on 80 years since the liberation of the camp. And of course, they're going to be holding a ceremony there. They always invite survivors to come back and participate, but unfortunately, the number of people alive or that can still travel are very few. They told us that the youngest survivor that they have on record is 80 years old. So there was a baby born in the camp at the time, or close to the time, of liberation. So, but as time goes on, there's less and less living. I do want to tell you about the death marches. I just want to comment on that very quickly. When the Germans knew that the war was being lost, they organized death marches. They would get the prisoners together, they would march them out of the camp, and they would go somewhere that they thought would be a safe haven away from the camp, that they couldn't be caught with having all these emancipated dead people there. So they took people on death marches, and they would march them somewhere for hours, for days, to get away from the camp. Thousands of people. And unfortunately, many of them did not survive. So not only did maybe they survived the camp being liberated, but they did not survive their final destination. And that's a sad part. I do want to share one other reading with you, and that will conclude this talk. And I found this, and I think it is very poignant in our world right now. It says, as we go forward into a future which is unknown, riddled with uncertainties, we should be vigilant of acts that divide us, acts that stem from hatred, driven by desires for power at the immense cost to others. We should stand up to these acts of hatred and division. Even if they have little effect on us now, they could affect us in the future. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And that's written by Martin Niemöller. And he was a German theologian and a Lutheran pastor. He wrote that poem in 1946, and he was a opponent to the Nazi regime. But I think that sums up what I saw and what I can share with you. Yeah, I guess, my thought is hearing this is, where were the voices to speak up for all those people who perished in those camps? Where were our religious leaders? And, the movie Bonhoeffer that was recently released can shed some light on that. I won't go into that. But anyway, that's a movie that I would ask you to see if you feel compelled to do so. And just in closing, thank you for listening to me. I want to thank Len for setting up this display. Thank you so much for that, and for the video presentation. Thank you to Sandy for sending out the invite and the correspondence for this. And thank you to those who listen.
Well, thank you, Bob. Thank you so much for that very moving and powerful presentation.
Thank you.
I invite all of you to turn on your microphones and perhaps your videos if you don't mind having your face on the video. Because Bob, are you still willing to
Yes.
take some questions?
Yep, I'll do my best.
Okay. So I'll let you regulate the question and answer time, Bob, because
Okay. Anybody have any question that they would want to ask me?
Why did you go back?
Why did I go back? Deborah, I guess I just felt so overwhelmed the first time I was there. And in 1974, I'll never forget this. It was a rainy, dreary day when we were there. And we went by bus. We went into the campsite at Dachau. The woman who was our guide was on the bus, and she was speaking about what to expect. And I remember her to this day crying, because she said that some of her relatives had perished in that camp. And walking through there, you were walking through history. And I guess I just felt like, if that could happen then, is it happening now? And of course, in our world today, it is happening now. We just don't hear about it perhaps as much as we should. But of course, it's happening in various countries in our world. And I just became, I don't want to say intrigued or fascinated, this whole experience was not joyful. There was nothing there that was joyful in the whole thing. It just really was, made you think. And I've read, I mean, Mark can attest to this if he's still on. I read books constantly about people that have been there, that have been rescued, that have died, that have shared their stories. I mean, I could recommend many different books that I could ask you to read if you're interested in that. I don't know. I just became, I don't want to say obsessed. I just became intrigued with it. I've been to Teresen. I know you've been there, Pat and Len. I know you've been there in the past. I've been there, but other than these camps, the only camp I didn't mention was the Monowitz camp. That was the third of the three. And that camp was virtually nothing. Everything was destroyed in there. It's just open farmland. There is a memorial plaque there. I think there might be one guardhouse that's there, but that was more or less a labor camp. And that was put on, if you're interested in that story, IG Farben Company was a huge German factory complex. And they operated out of Krakow, and they made rubber products and chemicals. And they worked for the Nazi government. They were contracted by them to provide items for the war effort. And they employed a lot of Jews, and they worked in their buildings, and helped them out. And then they set up the separate labor camp for them. So it wasn't really a death camp, but it was a working camp. But if somebody, did something wrong, if they did something out of step, if they violated something and they killed them, then they'd be sent to be cremated. But there's not much there anymore. In fact, that company was sold, so there really isn't much of anything there anymore. And by the way, Volkswagen Company was also another participant in the war effort, just so you know. But I guess that's the best I can tell you, Deborah. Anyone else?
Bob, have you been to Terezin camp?
Yes.
Yeah. For the rest of you, they have a terrific children's museum there. It gives you the life of what it was like for a child to be in a camp.
Yep. Yes, Rob Klein. Yes.
Can I just make a comment? I was doing a little bit of Googling while you were talking out of curiosity. Just to kind of bring it to current real time. There were approximately 16.5 million people who were incarcerated in concentration camps in Germany. We hear about the 6 million Jews, but there were also 3 million Soviet prisoners, 2 million Poles, 500,000 gypsies and disabled people. 1.5 million people were just shot out in the woods or on these marches or whatever. So 3.5 million actually, it's estimated, survived the concentration camps. So that comes to 16.5 million. And just to put some reality to that, there are approximately 13.9 million homosexuals in the United States. So if it could happen in a country like Germany, it can happen in our country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. That's the unknown. And that's what got me reading this last thing that I did, which I think brings home that point. One thing I thought about this week, the snow that we had here in Delaware. Okay. So imagine, could you go out and stand in that snow for hours on end in a thin, flimsy dress or striped pajamas, hours on end? That's what these people were subjected to day after day after day. How did they survive? They said that so many people, Jews anyway, that were in the camp, once they got out, they lost their religion. Where was their God in this? Yeah.
Or where were their co-believers?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, Bob, one of the recent books that I read, because I am fascinated by this. We've only been to Dachau, but I'm just intrigued that this went on, you know, sort of thing. But one of the books that I most recently read talked about those who got out. The United States sponsored all kinds of programs to help them get to the United States if they wanted to. And many of them basically decided if we escape Germany, if we escape Europe and get to America, we are going to totally start a whole new life, and denied being Jews. In fact, my best friend from high school, whose baby brother became an oncologist down in Sussex County and recently retired kind of thing, found out as adults that their family came from Germany. They were Jews in Germany, had the opportunity to come to America, and they basically rejected and actually didn't want to bring part of the family coming over because they retained their Judaism. And the family that had come first said, we don't want any parts of you. We can't risk, you know, something like that maybe happening here in the United States. So they were not reunited for 50 years.
Yep. Yes, Norm.
When I was in Delaware, I think it was Pastor Newmuller who came on campus. He was a very old man. He had to sit the whole time he was there. And he told us that he was at a function with Hitler, and he told Hitler off, and Hitler became furious. He says, "You're my personal prisoner," and he was immediately sent to Dachau. Well, he was still a minister. So he went to one of the guards and said, "I want a Bible." "You can't have a Bible in here." "Well, I'm Hitler's personal prisoner and I demand a Bible." And he got one.
Wow. Wow. That's it. You should write a book. Maybe he has. That's interesting. I want to let you know, don't forget, Hitler came to power with 33% of the German vote. 33%. So imagine that.
Scary.
Yep. Anyone else? If you do, I can't see your hand up or anything, so. Okay.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Bob.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Bob.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think we're just, Bob Paulin is just going to close us out with a brief prayer.
I'd like us to pray by taking a moment of silence, reflecting, and then I'm just going to share some words you're familiar with, and maybe I'll pause in between them, and then we'll close our meeting. So let us be in the attitude of prayer as we think about this incredible journey and our life today and what journey we're on. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song for peace, for your land and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. The skies are blue everywhere, as blue as mine are yours. Skies are everywhere as blue as mine. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hope and dreams as true as yours and mine. Oh, Master, let me walk with thee in lowly paths of service free. Tell me the service, help me bear the strain of toil, the fret of care. Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways. Reclothe us in your rightful mind, in deeper love, thy service praise, in deeper reverence, peace. Amen.
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 And unfortunately, I did not know everybody who was on. So if you would just send me a text or something so I know if you were on.